It was not a new weapon or advanced technology that created this shock. It was a strategy built on human sacrifice. Nearly 3,800 Japanese pilots willingly flew missions from which they knew they would never return. These aviators became known as kamikaze pilots, and their attacks forced the Allies to rethink how modern naval warfare could be fought against an enemy willing to die to inflict damage. If you love World War II history, hit subscribe, drop a like, and share this video with fellow history fans. The strategy began in late 1944 as Japan's military situation deteriorated rapidly. The once powerful fleets of the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered devastating losses in major naval battles, and Japan could no longer compete with the overwhelming industrial power of the United States. Aircraft, experienced pilots, and fuel were all in dangerously short supply. Faced with this reality, Japanese commanders turned to a desperate solution, transforming aircraft into guided weapons by sending pilots on deliberate suicide missions aimed at Allied ships. The word kamikaze, meaning divine wind, was drawn from Japanese history. It referred to the legendary typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets attempting to conquer Japan in the 13th century. Military leaders hoped these suicide pilots would become a modern version of that divine protection, striking American fleets with such ferocity that the invasion of Japan might be delayed or even stopped entirely. These attacks first appeared during the battle for the Philippines, but they reached their most terrifying intensity during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. As American forces approached the Japanese home islands, waves of suicide aircraft began diving toward the Allied fleet supporting the invasion. Radar operators would detect incoming aircraft, anti-aircraft guns would open fire, and fighter planes would scramble to intercept. But even one plane slipping through the defenses could cause catastrophic damage. Unlike traditional bombing runs, kamikaze attacks were extremely difficult to stop once the pilot committed to the final dive. The aircraft were often loaded with explosives and flown directly into the decks or hulls of ships at high speed. The resulting explosions could tear open flight decks, ignite fuel stores, and trigger massive fires that spread across the vessel. Even when ships survived the impact, the damage could leave them out of action for months. The psychological effect on sailors aboard American ships was profound. In earlier naval battles, enemy aircraft typically attempted to drop bombs or torpedoes and then escape. Kamikaze pilots, however, had no intention of surviving. Sailors watched as aircraft continued their dive even while engulfed in flames or riddled with gunfire. The realization that the attacker was deliberately sacrificing his life made each encounter more intense and unpredictable. At Okinawa alone, thousands of kamikaze sorties were launched against Allied ships. The attacks sank dozens of vessels and damaged hundreds more, making it one of the most dangerous naval environments of the entire war. Destroyers stationed on radar picket duty, ships placed far from the main fleet to detect incoming aircraft, often faced the heaviest attacks. These crews became some of the most exposed sailors in the Pacific, frequently defending themselves against multiple suicide planes approaching from different directions. Despite the destruction they caused, kamikaze attacks also revealed the desperate situation facing Japan by the final stage of the war. Many of the pilots were extremely young, some barely out of school. Training programs were shortened dramatically due to fuel shortages, meaning some aviators had only the most basic flight experience before being sent on their final mission. Farewell ceremonies were held before departure, and pilots often wrote letters to their families or composed poems reflecting on duty, honor, and sacrifice. For the United States, the rise of kamikaze tactics forced rapid adaptation. The United States Navy strengthened fleet defenses by improving radar detection, coordinating fighter patrols more aggressively, and surrounding ships with dense anti-aircraft firepower. Naval formations were adjusted so that incoming aircraft would face multiple layers of defensive guns, before reaching high-value targets like aircraft carriers. Yet even with these measures, the attacks could not be entirely prevented. The willingness of Japanese pilots to sacrifice themselves meant that every approaching aircraft represented a potential threat until it was completely destroyed. This constant danger kept sailors on edge and reinforced the belief among Allied planners that an invasion of Japan itself might provoke even more extreme resistance. The legacy of these 3,800 pilots remains one of the most haunting aspects of the Pacific War. Their missions demonstrated how ideology, desperation, and military necessity could combine to create tactics that defied conventional expectations of warfare. While the attacks did not ultimately stop the Allied advance, they left a lasting mark on the conflict and forced military strategists to confront a chilling reality. When an enemy is willing to turn human lives into weapons, the nature of war itself changes. In the final months of the Pacific Campaign, kamikaze attacks became both a symbol of Japan's determination and a warning of the potential cost of invading the Japanese mainland. For American commanders, the experience reinforced a difficult conclusion. Ending the war quickly had become not just a strategic objective, but a necessity to avoid an even greater catastrophe. As kamikaze attacks intensified during the final phase of World War II, the scale of the threat forced Allied commanders to rethink how fleets operated in combat zones. Naval formations were reorganized to create deeper defensive layers around aircraft carriers and troop transports. Destroyers and smaller escort ships were pushed farther from the main fleet to serve as early warning sentinels, forming what became known as radar picket lines. These ships used radar to detect incoming aircraft at long range, giving fighter squadrons precious minutes to intercept attackers before they reached the main fleet. However, serving on a radar picket ship was among the most dangerous assignments in the Pacific. Because these vessels operated far ahead of the fleet, they were often the first targets spotted by incoming Japanese aircraft. Kamikaze pilots frequently aimed for these isolated ships, knowing that destroying them could weaken the fleet's early warning system. Crews aboard these vessels endured repeated attacks, sometimes facing multiple suicide aircraft in a single day. Many ships survived only through relentless anti-aircraft fire and the quick response of nearby fighter pilots. The danger was especially severe for the aircraft carriers that formed the backbone of the United States Navy task forces. Carriers carried dozens of aircraft, large quantities of aviation fuel, and enormous stocks of ammunition. A successful kamikaze strike against a carrier's flight deck could ignite devastating fires and temporarily cripple its ability to launch aircraft. As a result, carriers were surrounded by rings of escort ships armed with heavy anti-aircraft guns, designed to create a protective barrier of defensive fire. Despite these precautions, some attacks managed to break through the defenses. When a kamikaze aircraft struck a ship, the impact was often followed by an explosion that tore open the deck and scattered burning fuel across the vessel. Damage control crews immediately rushed into action, battling fires, sealing ruptured compartments, and rescuing injured sailors. Their ability to control damage frequently determined whether a ship survived the attack or was lost to the sea. Meanwhile, Japanese military planners expanded the use of suicide tactics beyond aircraft. Specialized weapons were developed in the final stages of the war, including explosive motorboats, manned torpedoes, and small submarines intended for one-way missions. These weapons reflected the same underlying philosophy that had produced the kamikaze program. When conventional military strength could no longer match the enemy, self-sacrifice could still inflict damage and delay the advance of Allied forces. The pilots themselves came from many different backgrounds. Some were experienced aviators who volunteered for the missions, while others were young trainees who had been rushed through abbreviated flight programs due to the growing shortage of skilled personnel. Before departing on their final flight, pilots often participated in solemn farewell rituals. They shared final meals with fellow airmen, drank ceremonial cups of sake, and received headbands symbolizing courage and loyalty. Many wrote farewell letters to their families, expressing pride in their duty while also acknowledging the finality of the mission. For Allied sailors and pilots, confronting this tactic required a new level of vigilance and discipline. Radar operators watched their screens constantly for signs of approaching aircraft, while anti-aircraft gunners remained at their stations for long hours, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Fighter pilots patrolled the skies above the fleet, intercepting enemy aircraft before they could begin their attack dives. These layered defenses gradually reduced the effectiveness of kamikaze assaults, but the danger never fully disappeared. The experience also left a deep psychological impression on those who fought in the Pacific. The idea that an enemy pilot would intentionally crash into a ship challenged traditional expectations of combat. Sailors learned that even a damaged aircraft trailing smoke could still pose a deadly threat if the pilot remained determined to reach the target. As a result, every approaching aircraft was treated as potentially dangerous until it had been completely destroyed or driven away. By the final months of the war, kamikaze attacks had become one of the defining features of the Pacific conflict. Although they did not change the overall outcome, they inflicted significant damage and forced the Allies to devote enormous resources to defense. The tactic demonstrated how desperation and ideology could shape military strategy in extreme ways, transforming individual pilots into weapons in a struggle that had grown increasingly brutal. The legacy of those 3,800 pilots remains tied to the broader story of the Pacific War, a conflict where technological power, industrial strength, and human determination collided across vast oceans and distant islands. Their actions, controversial and tragic, reflected the desperate circumstances of a nation fighting against overwhelming odds and willing to embrace extraordinary measures in the final attempt to resist defeat. As the war moved toward its final stage, the continued use of kamikaze attacks became a powerful indicator of how far the conflict in the Pacific had escalated. By this point in World War II, the Japanese military could no longer rely on large fleet engagements or conventional air superiority. Instead, they focused on strategies designed to slow the Allied advance and inflict as much damage as possible during each confrontation. The goal was not necessarily victory in the traditional sense, but rather to raise the cost of every American operation so dramatically that political leaders might hesitate before continuing further. The impact of these attacks could be seen in the way American naval commanders adapted their operations. Task forces began maintaining greater distances between ships to reduce the risk of multiple vessels being struck in a single attack wave. Fighter patrols were expanded and kept constantly airborne above the fleet, ready to intercept incoming aircraft before they could begin their final dive. Even with these precautions, however, the possibility of a sudden strike remained ever present, reinforcing the need for constant alertness among crews. For many sailors, the emotional strain of these attacks was just as challenging as the physical danger. Long periods of waiting between alarms could be interrupted at any moment by the shout of incoming aircraft, sending gun crews racing to their stations. Radar operators scanned their screens for the faint signals that might reveal enemy planes approaching at low altitude. In these moments, the entire ship would shift instantly from routine operations to full combat readiness, demonstrating how unpredictable the threat had become. At the same time, Allied air forces intensified their efforts to destroy the airfields from which these suicide missions were launched. Bombers targeted runways, aircraft hangars, and fuel storage sites across Japanese-held territory in an attempt to reduce the number of planes capable of reaching the fleet. Fighter aircraft also conducted patrols near suspected launch points, intercepting enemy planes shortly after takeoff whenever possible. These efforts gradually limited the number of kamikaze sorties that could be launched, though they never eliminated the threat completely. On the Japanese side, the pilots selected for these missions were often portrayed as symbols of national determination. Military propaganda emphasized loyalty, courage, and sacrifice, presenting the kamikaze as warriors defending their homeland against overwhelming forces. While the reality behind these missions was far more complex, the narrative helped maintain morale within a country that was facing increasing military setbacks and devastating bombing raids. For American planners studying the broader situation, the persistence of these attacks reinforced the belief that Japan might resist an invasion with similar determination. If pilots were willing to sacrifice themselves in the skies above the Pacific, it seemed possible that soldiers and civilians might fight just as fiercely on the ground. This assumption played a major role in shaping the final strategic decisions of the war, as leaders searched for ways to end the conflict without triggering an even larger and more destructive battle. As the Pacific War approached its conclusion, the story of the kamikaze became one of the most striking examples of how ideology, desperation, and military necessity could converge during extreme circumstances. The tactic did not reverse Japan's declining position, but it left a powerful impression on everyone who encountered it. Ships bore the scars of impact, sailors carried the memories of sudden attacks, and military planners were forced to confront the sobering reality that warfare could take forms far beyond traditional expectations. In the broader narrative of the Pacific Campaign, the actions of those thousands of pilots marked one of the final, dramatic chapters of a conflict defined by determination on both sides. Their missions illustrated how far the war had evolved from the early battles of the 1940s into a struggle where technology, strategy, and human resolve all collided in increasingly extreme ways. Even after the war ended, the legacy of those attacks continued to influence how military leaders around the world thought about the limits of sacrifice, the psychology of combat, and the unpredictable nature of modern warfare.